Anne, would you like to start or would you like to wait a few more minutes? Sorry, you're on mute.
For me, everything is fine. So let me know what you feel is.
Okay, I guess we can wait 2 more minutes and then we can start. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all this morning, this afternoon, this night, wherever you are in the world. So today's webinar is on Khulna as a water-inclusive enclave, and it's the second session of the Water as Leverage for Resilient Asian Deltas webinar series. And my name is Faduma Ali, and I'm a member of the Water Youth Network's partnership team, and I'll be facilitating this event. So this webinar is divided into 3 parts. First, I'll introduce the speaker and the topic, and then we'll have a conversation for about 30 to 40 minutes with our speaker, who is Dr. Anne Nillesen. And finally, we'll have a question and answer period for about 15 minutes. So if you have any questions for our speaker, please post them in the chat box and we'll address them during the Q&A session. So please engage with us during this very interesting topic. So as a reminder, please turn off your videos and mute yourselves and ask all questions through the chat box. So firstly, I'll briefly introduce the Water Youth Network to you all. It's a global water connector in the water sector made up of a vibrant community of students and young professionals across many disciplines. So we as a Water Youth Network aim to connect young professionals and students in the water sector to one another and to empower young leaders to create and take forward sustainable solutions in the sector. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our special guest with us today, Dr. Anne Nillesen, who's an architect and urban designer and founded De Facto Architecture and Urbanism in 2006. She has worked on complex, large-scale urban design and flood risk management assignments, as well as several regional and local scale adaptation projects. So thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome. I will share my screen, but I don't have permission to do so yet.
No. Let me. Okay.
I think if you make me co-host, then I can share.
Okay, are you able to now? I think I've changed the settings.
Yeah, I'll give it a try. Yes, definitely.
Perfect.
Great. Then it should be that you can all see my screen now.
Yes.
So I'll tell a bit about Khulna Water as Leverage Inclusive City, as was explained, part of the Water as Leverage program, in which for 3 cities it was explored how water could really become an inclusive part of the urban development, both in a spatial as well as in an economical way. Well, we worked on that with a big team. This is the position of the city of Khulna, so we can really see it's in the middle of the Ganges-Brahmaputra delta. And we started as all the teams with an analysis on a regional scale to really understand what the area is about. And when we look at Khulna, we see that actually the more dynamic part of the delta surpassed this area already. What often happens with rivers before they were all trained and fixated is that they have this natural movement through an area. This used to be a very dynamic region. We see the erosion and sedimentation now moved more eastwards. And what we also see is that due to siltation, this river actually got a bit disconnected from the main stream. So we see where in the 1960s, the streams were still around 5,000 cubic meter per second. Now it's more around thousands. And in the dry season, it's almost fully reduced, which means that the river doesn't have that much flow anymore. So there's both more saline water coming in, and also the silt is not being flushed out anymore. So the riverbed slowly gets positioned higher and higher. So at a higher elevation level and becoming to be positioned higher than the surrounding area. Here we see this salinity issue, and in that sense, Khulna is very characteristic for a lot of other delta areas we work in. So we see that in a lot of deltas we now work in the Mekong Delta, the challenges are quite similar. So we see that salinity borders are with climate change being pushed up. This is because of the sea level rise, also because of dredging of the river channels and of less water coming downstream. So this salinity increasingly goes landward. Another phenomena that we really see in Khulna, we also have that a bit in the Netherlands, is that a lot of polders have been constructed. And what happened is that after the polders were constructed, the land within the polder started subsiding, making it that those polders cannot naturally drain anymore towards the riverbed. So that means there's a lot of waterlogging within those areas. So here we see the blue areas, which are agriculture polders, where it's difficult to get the water out. And we see that in the agriculture pattern. Rice is still very important for Bangladesh. And what we see is that the amount of rotations of crop, tree is ideal economically. We see that there are more areas where there's only one crop rotation, especially in this saline area. And we see a lot of farmers switching towards shrimp farming. This is the flood risk and cyclone. As you see, we did quite a lot of research in the beginning. And here we also see that in the future, Khulna will enter this flood, kind of coastal flooding threat area. What we see from the erosion and accretion is that here there's still a lot of sediment within the river. The sediment enters the sea, and because of the currents, the area in front of the city of Khulna, which is called the Sundarbans, there's a Bangladeshi and Indian part of the Sundarbans, still rose with the sea level. So, so far it can still keep up with the sea level growth. So this forms a natural protection. And in general, we said around this, the city of Khulna, there are three kind of different zones. The reason that it's also so important to look at those different zones is that when you're interfering in a city, in a water system, very often the cause of what is ongoing there can be found elsewhere. So I think that is one of the important lessons we found so far with designing on this flood risk water management team in relation to urbanism, is that it always starts from kind of a system analysis, understanding what's going on before you start taking interventions. And what we really see here is that we have three different kind of system areas. We have the freshwater zone. So here we really see that Gorai River uptake with the biggest challenge related to making sure there's sufficient water available and the drainage is sufficient. We have this transition zone where salinity is coming in, and a lot of polders have been constructed that now create a lot of challenges. And we have the coastal zone itself with the Sundarbans as a natural protection that is slowly in time degrading. And what we did is within this project, we defined projects also on those different skill levels. So we have one major project on the regional skill, which is the restoration of the Gorai offtake. So this is silted, but if it would be opened up, more water would come in this stream again. The other rivers have sufficient water to do this. And also more fresh water would be available for those drier areas more northward. Then on the large scale, we also feel it would be good to address the Sundarbans. They're eroding now, and there's also a lot of pollution from the north, from the agriculture. So this should be addressed. Then we made a polder strategy for tidal river management to slowly restore the original height of the polders. And then we have an urban strategy for the city of Khulna. I'll describe the bigger projects quite briefly and then focus on the design for the city of Khulna. If we look at the Sundarbans, we see that it's a natural area with a lot of mangrove forest. The mangrove forest helps catching the sediment and makes it possible for the area to grow with the sea level rise, but it also has a very important ecological function. And if we look at this map, we see that over time, the green one is the current Sundarbans. It has decreased a lot. And there's a lot of worries about coastal erosion, but you actually see that the coastal erosion is less than the man-made taking over of the forest and transferring the lands into agricultural lands. So that is an important one. We also see a lot of shrimp farming close that increases the salinity. So here we see the areas on the tips that are eroding. We see in the west, it's much more because less of the sediment accretes here. So one of the ideas we had for this is to use building with nature as erosion protection. This can be done with natural materials. So by making a natural fence, the water behind it will kind of slow down and lose its energy, and the sediments will deposit there. Another option could be ecotourism. Ecotourism is always a bit tricky because it really needs to be done well to function and not interfere with ecology. And we designed this transition zone for agriculture on the north of the Sundarbans, where you could have more education on the use of fertilizers that now pollute a lot of the Sundarbans and have more tree plantations already, more than just rice, so that you would really create that transition for species, but also for the quality of water. The cost I'll not go into today. Then the sustainable agriculture polders. What we see in the agriculture polder is that a lot of water is pumped from the groundwater, and that again results in subsidence. So the water is pumped up and the land at the same time goes down. And we see this huge use of fertilizers because of the land becoming more barren. What we see in time is there used to be crop farming. After poldering the area, the land started subsiding and getting more saline water in. And the saline water from the fish ponds on its turn also pollutes the groundwater with more salinity. As a strategy for that, we proposed a principle that has already been tested in Bangladesh, which is tidal river management. What is done in the tidal river management is that the rivers in Bangladesh are very rich of sediment. So by letting in the river water with the sediment and then letting just the water go out again, you can get up to 50 centimeters of growth a year in the deepest places. So there's a lot of sediment that could really help restoring and elevating some of the areas. Water could be stored much more. So what we see is that now all water in the wet season is drained. In the dry season, there's a shortage. So by storing it and buffering it, it could be a buffer. And of course, also the crops can be transitioned to crops that need less water, can resist salinity, and will have a higher economic yield. What is important in Bangladesh is that the crops do require labor, because a lot of workers are dependent on agriculture work. So that is for the surroundings of Khulna. Of course, the city of Khulna is also very interesting. Here we see an aerial photo of the city of Khulna. And we see that it has quite a dense historic area, a more peri-urban area with a lot of ongoing developments, and then a lot of agriculture land on the edge of the city that is now more and more being developed. When we look at the city, the gray part is the built area, and the urbanization has in many places really started on the higher ridges. So was in an area where the water could naturally flood downhill, where it could be stored. And we now see that the city is extending into these areas where naturally the water would be captured. And that will cause us a lot of urban drainage challenges. Here we see in red the new outline of the city for 2050. Khulna has a big growth ambition. And what our principle was for this area is that we said there's this water cycle where cities very often go from a water supply city to a sewer city to a drain city and then to a waterway city. So there's this ongoing cycle. And here, for instance, we see an example in South Korea where it went from a city very close to the river to a city in which the river was really gone in this way and replaced with a lot of infrastructural roads, where in 2005 they just removed part of the road and really reopened the city and gave a lot of space to it again to be able to deal with the needs for drainage. And what we wanted to do in Bangladesh is to really skip this in between step, because of course it's very costly to later do such a big interventions and immediately make sure that the space is reserved. Oh, sorry. What that means for our strategy is that we said for the city itself, of course, there are already a lot of buildings. So we want to retain and store as much water as possible, but that will not be sufficient to really store all the water. So we'll have to drain part of the water. In the bigger city area, we also want to restore and retain as much water as possible and drain a little when needed. Oh, sorry, I have this cough. Don't worry, people, this is asthma cough and not any scary COVID-19 cough. I have it always, but this is, of course, the inconvenient moment. Take a sip of water. So what we did is we had the engineers from our team making a rainwater projection. So what we see here is a rainstorm that occurs once every year, and this is the surface you would need to store the water. This is a rainstorm once every 10 years, and this is a rainstorm once every 100 years. And you see that a lot of the current urban area is already being flooded, but especially the new urbanized area will be really threatened by rain flood. So what we did as a strategy is that we said we need to make some zoning program. There are areas that can be permanently wet, also needed for ecology, such as an old stream. There are areas that can seasonally flood, which actually already happens a lot. For instance, some of the rice fields. But there can also be areas in the urban area that can flood on a yearly basis. If, for instance, the sports fields, the parks, once a year will be flooded, that will not do any economic damage. There are also functions such as the private gardens, the street markets, the streets itself that you don't want to flood, except there's really an extreme situation. And they're the places you would never like to flood, such as the hospitals. You would like to have some safe shelters for cattle. So with this zoning, you could really, with all the sand that is available, start looking at developing parts of the city on different heights, and with that creating some kind of safety level. But we would need to store a lot of water to do that. So this, for the different zones, is the amount of area we would need to find within the city center or in the urban area to be able to store water. And you can see we were really pasting with where can we do that. What we saw overall is that in the urban area, there was much less space available, as in many urban areas. But what is interesting, since it's higher positioned, ponds would be very effective. So the ponds could be deeper, because in a pond you can never store more water than the groundwater level. And since this is a higher area, the ponds can really work. We could do a lot of roof storage, and we could do a lot of water storage with new development. In the peri-urban area, we see that there's much more space still available. So there our strategy really focused on making sure that open space remains available and having a lot of multifunctional public spaces. So I'll show that later on. With the Muyur River, which is a stream, an original stream that is currently at the edge of the city, the strategy was really to protect it, to make sure it would survive. And that was really necessary because more and more buildings are starting to appear within it. And in the new development areas, where actually very often an area is already elevated, which means the area around it floods more. But if everyone does that, that will not work. So there we had the concept of the water inclusive city, where people with new developments also need to create a buffer space for water. Here you see a bit of the water balance with that. I don't know whether you guys are more in the urban design corner or more in the water management corner. But from the engineers in our team, or together with them, actually, we constructed this water balance where you have those different return periods with different amounts of water that would really hit the city. And you see in a yearly event, we could store a lot already in the existing city. We would still need to drain, but for the rest, we could capture and retain everything. In a TS10 year rain event from the dense urban area, we would have to drain quite a lot to the adjacent area. And even there, we cannot store everything. And we really need to store a lot in the Muyur River. So the Muyur River on this kind of every 10-year basis would be a very important storage. If we look at the really TS100, you see from the new area, we always say there's no drainage. And that is because we feel that these areas should really be able to store a lot of water without putting extra pressure on the drainage system. But we see that here a big capacity from the Muyur River would be needed to bring it to the main river and drain some water out. Of course, it was not only about water. We also did a lot of interviews locally to see what were the ambitions for this city, what is needed, and how could we combine this space that we like to appoint for the water, also with other urban functions, such as, well, increasing the aesthetics, increasing recreational and tourism facilities, boosting economy, creating pleasant places to be in. When I start with the pond project, what you see here is there's still a lot of ponds available in the city. This map we see is the land price map. And what we see on the land price map is that actually the ponds are quite cheap to purchase compared to the other built area. So a lot of ponds are being bought and then transferred to building grounds. So what we really wanted to do is highlight 100 ponds within the area and start reclaiming and protecting them. So by creating different types of ponds, the community pond, the urban pond park, hidden eco ponds that could be in building blocks, and also multifunctional ponds that can be cricket fields that in extreme events could flood. We want to create a series of at least 100 ponds that have this really assigned function and will not be subject to being built. And what we also want to do is that all the new buildings being constructed, there are a lot of buildings being constructed out of concrete. So they are very well suited for rooftop storage and then capturing the water, either to filter it for flushing toilets or for watering plants. And we want the building regulations to be able to create more space. So what we see is that though the cities in Bangladesh are quite high density, there's not a lot of high rise. There are a lot of building regulations preventing buildings to be higher than 5 stories. And this is a bit of a New York building principle where you can give exceptions on building regulations. So people can, for instance, build higher than 5 stories, provided that 50% of the plot is open water. So you can play with the building regulations, which are actually followed quite well in Bangladesh. This was a collage of that. We actually took a drone to be able to make those kind of pictures and later collages. So this is in a neighborhood where there are some bigger buildings, some hotels that could be used really well for storing water from the roof. For the peri-urban area, this is a picture of the current situation. Here we see quite a big pond already, actually. And here it would really be about protecting these ponds. We see that buildings are already occurring in it. So it's really about protecting that outline, for instance, by giving it the function of a public park, so that the edges are better framed, add a lot of water quality improvement vegetation, and also make sure that all the new buildings will store water at their own building. And these ponds also have a very important social function. So not all the ponds have to be designed fully. This is a collage of a pond where you just really mark it with a small hard structure, but for the rest, the ponds can be as they are almost are already. As a second element, we really had the project of the Moyur. So this is again that old small creek everything drains to, running through the city. And what we see that in the urban area here, this Moyur already got quite thin. So here it's actually the grounds are already more expensive. So here what you can add to the Moyur is just some small recreational spaces to really make sure it becomes this continuous line, but land prices are very high. On the edges, outside the built area, the land is still much more affordable. So here you could purchase some bigger areas of land that coincide with the ambition of the city to make bigger parks here, recreational parks. And by building regulations, you could protect some of the villages that are here by making sure there's no ground for urban development. The same here, as long as it's remained as agriculture, those areas can remain free and have quite a big buffering capacity for water. And what is interesting is that this milieu will be in the heart of the future urban development. So it can really become this green urban city core that can become this central park for the city of Khulna. And it can also really provide that qualitative space, recreational space, and contribute to the at least slightly cooling effect of the city. Yeah, here we see these land prices. So we see in green the lower prices, in red the higher prices. So we see that these areas where we would like to really reserve ground both have lower ground prices. So it's easier to construct, for instance, a walkway or a path alongside it. But also, as I said, by having those building regulations, not having this destined in the zoning plan as building grounds, you can really protect them and keep a lot of space for water. This is, for instance, how these areas look like now. And if you would make sure you reserve part of the land and not give everything this urban destination, in time in the urban destination area, buildings will arise, but these in-between areas will start functioning as a big city park. This is the current milieu, so we also see the poor water quality with many water hyacinths coming up. We also see that there's no transportation possible anymore, so the whole transportation function that the milieu could bring has disappeared. We see some illegal building, but also some development building. And we would really like to translate that in an area that has much more filtering of the water. So better water quality by not flushing all the rainwater, but also storing part of this good quality water, having constructed wetlands that can really filter it, and creating this walkway around it. We're deliberately not removing the informal housing alongside it. You can just work around it with having such a walk path that then really becomes the new border of the Muir River, and also transportation will become possible again. So these are some of the functions and the storage capacities again. And some of the budget will go in purchasing land on the edges to create a walkway. The last concept is for the new built area. We did a test on how much water you would need to store to really be able to catch that 1 in 100 year storm. That would be 25% of the area. On the one hand, that's a lot. On the other hand, when we started drawing, we even got at very interesting possible developments that could even have more than 25% of free space. So by having public-private partnership development, it would be possible to deepen some areas, build up the other areas with that to elevate them, and then to create urban developments in which there's a lot of water storage capacity. So this is a bit that current area where you should, in a new development, still make sure there's sufficient area that in extreme events can store water. And of course, you can have some important functions such as the main streets that remain dry. And in the more extreme situations, you really have some vital connections still present, and even much more storage. So this is when we look at it from a 3D perspective. Here we see the Muir River. So this would be the 100 projects spread over the existing city. The Muir, where really a lot of water can be stored, especially to capture the water from the city. And then the new development area that will be fully water inclusive, store its own water, and not at peak moments have to discharge to the Muir. That's the story so far.
So is that the end of the presentation?
Yes, this is the end of the
Oh,
presentation.
thank
Yes.
you. So now I'd like to open the floor for questions and answers for the question and answer session. So please write your questions and comments in the chat box and I'll read them out to Dr. Nillesen. I'll start out with my question. So I thought that the different zones that you were describing was really interesting and really innovative because like I've never heard of it. Do you have an example of other cities that have used this model?
Not yet. We're now working in Rwanda, in the city of Kigali, where we're trying to come up with a similar approach, except that it's not really zones there, but we're defining 6 to 8 different typologies that each have their own possibilities for retaining and storing rainwater.
Yeah.
And we're making a design for 6 to 8 of these typologies that can then later be scaled up in the city. So that is at least one location where it's now being applied.
That's interesting. So one question, how significant is the role of aquifer recharge in the overall water management plan for Khulna?
That's a good question. I actually forgot to explain that, so I'm glad this is asked. That is if you let a urban designer present a story that is also made together with hydraulic engineers. No, it's very important. And that is really one of the functions as well of the ponds, that by having all this water storage in the area, of course, a part of it will evaporate, but the idea is also really that you give the water the opportunity to infiltrate again, to at least at a shallow level be able to really re-infiltrate water and have more water available in the bottom. There are points where it also really works for the deeper aquifers, but here we mainly focused on the shallow aquifers.
Oh, okay. So the next question, Philip from the Water Youth Network and the Institute of Spatial Planning at TU Dortmund University in Germany. He said, thank you so much for your really interesting presentation. How did you engage residents in the design process apart from a part of the interviews? He said, I'm bringing this up because I know how challenging it can be to have planning and design processes be inclusive of all social groups here in Germany or in Europe in general. And I can imagine that it might have been quite hard to have a process inclusive of the groups and demographics that are often left out of the decision-making processes.
Yeah, I think that's it's a very important point, and it's something that I also recognize a lot from our project in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, there's actually a lot of awareness of stakeholder participation. In this project, it was actually quite challenging. Because at the moment we were working on the project, from the Prime Minister office, there was a regulation very swiftly implemented that was removing all illegal buildings from the riverfront. And what is good to know is that in Bangladesh, other than in a lot of other countries, illegal building is not necessarily related to slum dwelling. So it's also a lot of project developers that just bypass the regulation and start developing bigger towers along the riverfront. So at the moment we were doing this project quite forcefully, a lot of those illegal buildings were being demolished, and there was of course a lot of anger on this. So at this moment it was a bit difficult to really engage communities, because there was the risk of our project that has to do with the Mayur restoration being confused with the other project of the removal of buildings. So in that sense, in this project, the stakeholder consultation was a bit less elaborate than we would normally do. But in generally, what we normally like to do is to, at the beginning of the process, really have workshops with a lot of neighborhood representatives, and really ask what is important for them, but also really have them support with the analysis. Very often there's no data available about how high the water is in different areas. That is actually something we did here, that we did a lot of tours through a lot of different areas and asked people how high will the water come, what was the damage, how are you affected by this, what would be important for you to have as a space, what are you missing in daily life, what would you like to add to the city. So that has been done. But in general, the stakeholder process when it comes to inhabitants was a bit more basic than normal.
Yeah, I can imagine. So another question, what are some of the successes and failures, like examples from this project that you would like to share with us? And what do you think could have been done differently?
I think one of the successes is to really look at that regional context to better understand the system. I think what also worked really well for us, and is something you maybe would not always do, is to really have this conceptual understanding of the city, more than just starting design projects at different locations, so that also after the study is completed, it can really function as something that can be scaled up and is can be replicated. I think one of the things that was quite a challenge, well, I think integrated design teams in general are quite a challenge. So where we almost had the feeling that by now we should be able to have like this smooth internal process, we still saw that this integral work, understanding each other's principles and work methods still took a lot of effort. And we also saw that in the departments. So what you see is that a lot of the departments of the city are still sectoral, as is the same actually in the Netherlands. So that when you work with the construction side of the municipality that would normally deal with these water-related projects, you would actually also like to include the City Development Authority. That is more about the urban planning and spatial projects and the green structures. But it was quite difficult to really connect these departments, not so much in making the vision and making the design, but it was challenging in how to come to realizing this, getting the budget for it, because of course every department would like to be the department to get the loan or the budget assigned to their department. So I think that where the design got integral to also get to an integrated implementation is still quite a challenge. So that would definitely be where our focus would be more on next time.
Yeah. So Shuja from New Delhi has two questions. Would you like me to ask both of them together or one by one?
Oh, go ahead. I'll see how far I get. Yeah.
Okay. So have you worked only on the unbuilt part of these coastal cities, or on the infrastructure too? And the second question is, what do you think should be the percentage of storage, drainage, and groundwater recharge for the green areas?
Well, the surface storage capacity that we came out of to really be able to store all the water was 25%, which is quite high. For example, in the Netherlands, that's around 10%. The amount that is recharged, it is not so much that we had a target for it, but more said whatever can be recharged should be recharged. So that means that we would take measures when designing the ponds, that the bottom clay layer will be removed so that it better infiltrates. So we would optimize infiltration, but it's not that we really had a percentage of water that should infiltrate. It was more of a goal as much as possible. And I told you to ask two questions, but now you'll see that actually I forgot the first question.
No worries. So did you work on only the unbuilt part of these coastal cities or also on the infrastructure?
Well, normally it's a combination. So normally it's really a combination of thinking where to solve things in the public space or in buildings, and where to address things such as high river water, really with infrastructural works. I'm not sure if that fully answers the question, but that is at least, yeah, mostly a combination of both.
Okay, great. So Philip from the Water Youth Network said, also, as you mentioned Kigali, is it possible to reach out to you in the future? I'm trying to come up with a PhD project inspired by the water as leverage in Tasmania or South Africa. So I might be interested to learn more about what you do in Kigali.
Yeah, definitely. We just started there. We're on the road for about a month now. It's a lot about really focusing on nature-based solutions, but it's definitely a very interesting case. So feel free to reach out.
Okay. So Amar from the Water Youth Network asks, does designing most of the ponds on the left side of the river have anything to do with the elevations of the area?
Yeah, and actually, yes and no. Actually, the ponds that are designed on the right side really has to do with the elevation of the area. So because the area is higher, it's a pity that we don't have the groundwater line in here. You can store a lot more water, because in order to be able to store water, a pond needs to be empty. So the deeper and the emptier it can be, the more water it can store. And in this higher grounds, we could make the ponds much deeper and really increase the amount of water we could store. On the left, most of the areas are quite shallow. So here you would need a lot of surface to store the same amount of water. So that is actually why here we see these big surfaces, both because we have the opportunity, because it's still unbuilt, so it's easier to realize this, but also because the storage is not that deep, you need those yeah, big surfaces.
Okay. Anor from the Water Youth Network says, thank you very much for the presentation. My question would be, what are the ways to attract investment for the implementation from the government and the MDBs?
Yeah, no, actually that was of course quite a challenging one. And we also see that really looking at this kind of investment models was still quite challenging in this project. So that is actually one of the things I thought maybe I should mention that when they asked what needs to be done better next time. What you see is that a lot of the business case models, there are a lot of qualitative benefits of doing these kind of things, such as improved urban quality. We already saw from studies in the Netherlands that houses next to good quality water have 10% extra value. We know it from New York Central Park, that the houses around these parks have much greater value. And there is a value of good green structures within the city. Where here we looked at the investments is mostly from the water system. So we did some calculations. Maybe it's even behind here, I'll check. No, unfortunately it's not. But what we did see is that the interventions that would be necessary in the future, if you don't change the system to storing more water, would be quite severe. So what you see if a city develops further and you have a lot of high quality building, a lot of roads, a lot of economic functions on these, and it keeps flooding, then there's really a big economic impact. So in that sense, there would be a lot of economic damage, and the pumping stations, for instance, that would be needed here to make sure you drain all the water would be huge. So it would take a very severe network to drain all this water. At the same time, there would also, after the water is drained, in the dry periods, be a huge water scarcity. Which would mean that the whole pipeline construction, because water is already brought from kilometers long pipelines from other rivers. So if you would not adapt, you would get a lot of cost in the future that you can now prevent. Unfortunately, however, not a lot of business models or governments are calculating yet in this way. So there's still a very big gap between showing that this will save cost on the long term and the investment that needs to be done on the short term. Some investment can be done privately, like the new buildings, but the green structure should really be a government or city investment.
I understand. Someone else has asked, in terms of saltwater intrusion in coastal cities, how do you design the pond to avoid the intrusion? Thank you for your answer.
In this area, it's not so much that we do use that. Actually, we are now making a climate adaptation strategy in our own country, which is actually quite fun because we normally mostly work abroad. So we're doing the climate adaptation strategy for Amsterdam, and there we really see that introducing extra water can help in keeping out part of the salt water. But here it's not yet really used for that. It helps a bit, but it's still mainly focused on recharge and preventing further salinization. But I don't think yet that here the pressure really comes from the water coming from the ground. So it's more the infiltration from the top. But in the Netherlands, we're definitely looking at that because there we have the saltiness really being pressed from the sea under the land, then coming up, and there that really helps.
So Tapsaya from the Faculty of Urbanism at TU Delft said, thank you for this insightful presentation. My question is, most of the water systems in developing countries are high on water pollution, which plays a significant part in order to restore water systems to their natural state, as well as maintain their performance for a natural event like floods. Was this considered as part of the design?
Yeah, and definitely, but this is really one of the challenges, I think, with these kind of projects, and especially with the water system. It's all interrelated. So addressing or fixing one part of the water system, of course, doesn't help at all if in the other areas it's still being heavily polluted. So in that sense, also in this project, there was a much bigger kind of parallel program on solid waste management, outplacing polluting industries, creating water purification for those industries. For the normal pollution, more the street runoff pollution, we could solve a lot with having halophytes and plants in this area, but the heavy pollution you need to address.
So another question, from your experience with the water as leverage, how do you feel youth could be more involved with programs like this?
Oh, sorry, I muted myself to cough. I think youth is so essential because what we saw a lot from working in Bangladesh is that there are, of course, a lot of departments that have their own way of working, that have their traditions that are very much, and this is not so much Bangladesh, this is actually a bit worldwide, but a bit more of the, I hope I'm not insulting anyone, but older engineering generation that is really focused on creating as much drainage as possible, as much structures as possible to really control the water system. And I think this kind of adaptation approach is just starting to come and get introduced. And I also always really have the feeling that at least me as a designer, I'm not really yet equipped to deal with it really well. It's just in our studies, we never had these kind of projects. So we're trying to deal with it as well as we can. But I really feel that the younger generation is going to have so much more tools. If I see what is in the study programs now, how much integral work is almost a normal part of working for you all, how much adaptation is already really in the mindset. I think it's not my generation, and I'm not even that old yet, but it's not my generation that will make this difference. It will really be the current youth that have so many more tools to think integral and be able to deal with this.
So the next question is, Shu just said, just out of curiosity, are you also working on other areas in Bangladesh?
Currently not. We worked at the Bangladesh Delta Plan, and at that Delta Plan, we had a very strong focus on a few main regions that also included Dhaka, Chittagong, and the Barint area. So there are wider studies, but we're currently not working on realizing any other projects.
And what would you say is your message to the youth who are inspiring to become the future urban water planners, policymakers, and I guess just going into the water sector?
What would be my message to them, you asked?
Yes.
I don't think you guys need a message, because the fact that you're here in this lecture already means you're interested in this and it's relevant for you. As I said, I think you guys will have much better tools to address this than I have. So I'm really looking forward to have you guys working on these kind of assignments and come up with new solutions. I think my advice would be, and that is a puzzle we're ourselves still trying to kind of deal with, is to really find integral ways of planning and I think we're now quite far in integrating spatial assignments with water-related assignments, and I think the next step is to really well integrate financial mechanisms with that, governance mechanisms. So to keep on widening this, be very interesting.
So I guess this brings us to the end of our second webinar of the Water as Leverage webinar series. Thank you, Dr. Nillesen, for taking the time to join us today. It's been inspiring to hear your discussion on Khulna. And thank you to all the viewers for joining us. And please give us your feedback on this webinar by filling out the Google form that we've shared through the email. Stay tuned for on our Facebook and Twitter pages for our future webinars. I've shared the links in the chat box. So with that, I say I wish you a very pleasant weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy, and goodbye for now.
Thank you all for taking the time to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Are you done?